name's Maajid Nawaz. I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you in person, but we decided the second best option was to link us with a video link. Today, I'm going to be speaking to you about ideas, narratives, and the social change, and the importance of ideas in society.
Right. You should be able to see the slides now. The first slide that you should be able to see, the title slide, Ideas, Narratives, and Social Change. We are beginning this presentation on the importance of ideas, and it really starts with an incident that occurred to me when I was speaking in Pakistan to a friend, and I was speaking to him about the fact that we wish to develop an ideational consensus inside Pakistan about the direction that the country should head in. And his response to me was that it's all good and well speaking about ideas, but what we also need is to do some real work. And he then began to proceed to speak about building wells and hospitals and schools, which I agreed with him was real work and is very important. But I said that also it's wrong of us to portray the realm of ideas as the unreal work or the work that doesn't really count. And this presentation is about why ideas are so important, why it's so important to develop a consensus on the fundamental direction that a nation should take and the narratives that come from that direction. Moving to the first slide, you should be able to see a picture of a man in deep thought with a question mark dangling above his head. And the basic idea here is that what we want to discuss is how nations progress only when they develop a consensus in the fundamental direction that they wish to take. And in the absence of that consensus, the nation can never really progress. All we end up doing is pretty much plugging the holes where the leaks are. We end up as a good people. We do collect much charity. We distribute much charity. With the recent example of the floods, people are donating. People are rushing to help. But all we are ever able to do is respond to problems in a haphazard and ad hoc way. Because there's fundamentally no consensus, well, essentially the system isn't working to solve those problems. But the reason why the system isn't working is what we need to question. And the reason why a system fails to work, and if we look at and survey societies through history, the times when a system fails to work is when a consensus no longer exists in that nation as to the direction that that country wishes to take. So the consensus is very important. And if we look at some examples through history, we'll see the importance of developing a consensus and what happens when that fundamental consensus breaks apart. If we move to the second slide here, we'll be able to see the case study that I want to talk you through, which is Pakistan and the idea of Pakistan. And if we look at this case study, we see that the reason to create Pakistan began fundamentally with nothing but an idea. And it was that idea that led to people adopt a narrative, and the narrative spread far and wide. The narrative was that Muslims require a separate state in order to safeguard their interests from a Hindu-majority India. It doesn't matter whether the narrative in hindsight was true or false. It doesn't matter if we now look at India and we can have an academic dispute as to whether Muslims are better or worse off in India than they are in Pakistan. Because for a narrative to succeed and take off, its truth rarely matters. What matters is that it captures the imagination of the people and bolsters the essential idea. The idea in this case being the need for the creation of Pakistan for Muslims to have a homeland. And any idea, it requires a combination of leaders, of symbols, of alliances, and then, of course, the narrative that we've just spoken about. So without leaders and symbols, and without alliances, that idea can't take off. In the case of Pakistan, we have the leaders of Jinnah and Iqbal, as you see the photos there on the screen, and there are other leaders as well. And Pakistan has many symbols to bolster that idea. And what symbols achieve is that they provide a brand for the idea. They provide people to be able to visually associate that idea with certain pictures and images. And of course, it goes without saying that the importance of leaders are to set the direction and the strategy for the propagation of that idea. But leaders and symbols are not in themselves sufficient. For an idea to truly take off, it needs alliances. And the Muslim League was one such alliance. And one of the skills of Jinnah, and in fact also one of the problems in the creation of Pakistan, was his ability to gather such diverse array of views together and bring them behind the fundamental idea of the reason for why Pakistan should exist. And I say that was also one of the problems in the creation of Pakistan because, of course, Jinnah died before he was able to really solidify that alliance. And we know the break-offs and the various factions that emerged after his death and the direction that Pakistan took soon afterwards. But alliances for the spread and propagation of any idea are essential. So without leaders, without alliances, and without symbols, an idea really cannot move forward. But also, coming back to the importance of the narrative. The narrative provides a spin. It provides an angle on any news event. And so, whereas people would see one incident or one event through a certain perspective or through a different analysis, the narrative provides the person adhering or following this particular idea with a framework through which to explain or through which to interpret that particular news event, for example. So let's take again, working through the case study, the narrative through the creation of Pakistan. If there are people who, with the separation, people who moved or emigrated from India to what is now Pakistan, a lot of atrocities took place in that time. A lot of killings and massacres took place during that period. But the narrative behind the idea for the creation of Pakistan was able to use those examples. It was able to use those atrocities in the favor of its idea, in the favor of the creation of Pakistan. Because the narrative was able to say, look, this demonstrates, these massacres show why Muslims cannot live in India, because the Hindus are killing them. And that's why Muslims need a separate state to safeguard their interests from a Hindu-majority India. So the narrative is like a virus. It can cling on to any news incident. It can cling on to any event and provide a interpretive framework through which to bolster the original idea. And that's the importance of the narrative. And we're going to come back to revisit the theme with a narrative shortly. Moving to the next slide, you see here an image of myself. You may be wondering why I'm handcuffed to another man with police around me. And the reason for that is I myself used to believe in a certain idea. I used to adhere to and propagate a certain narrative. For 13 years of my life, I was a member of an extreme organization that believed in a fundamentally different vision for Pakistan, different to the one that Jinnah had, but one that I believed was true. And the consensus that I tried to build, just like others built consensus in societies, the Muslim League built a certain consensus behind which Pakistan was created. For 13 years, the consensus that I tried to build was one that was very different to the original vision for Pakistan. So I believed that Islam was not compatible with democracy. In fact, I believed that any Muslim who propagated democracy and believed in it was an apostate. I believed that Islam was not compatible with religion-neutral politics. I believed that Islam was also not compatible with individuals following their own interpretations of Islam, individual choice in religion. I believed that, in fact, Islam was a complete system of life, a complete and total political ideology that defined its own system of governance. And that system of governance, I believed that the word I used was the word khilafat. So for 13 years, I spread this idea in my attempt to create a consensus in Pakistani society, but as I said, a very different consensus. But still, nevertheless, I was working to build a consensus because I recognized one thing, and that was without this fundamental consensus in the direction, the civilizational direction we wanted to take Pakistan in, Pakistan would not be able to move forward. So I was of the view I was presenting Pakistanis with a choice. The choice I was presenting them was either you follow the Western ideals of democracy, secularism, and liberalism, or you follow Islam and its complete and total system of life. And until we first resolve this question, we will not be able to move forward as a nation. Well, the latter part of that statement was correct. Until we solve the question of the direction of the nation, then we will not be able to move forward. We will not be able to progress. But the former part of that statement, that Islam was juxtaposed somehow against democracy and against individual choice and against pluralism, that's the part that I later came to review. But before I get to that, having spent 13 years in this organization, the reason why you see this photograph in front of you is I was eventually arrested in Egypt and sentenced to 5 years in prison for believing in these ideas. And that picture you see there is a picture of me being marched to court on trial in Egypt. I eventually served my sentence in Mazra'atura prison in Cairo with some of the founders and leaders of the first jihadist groups in the world that all emanated from Egypt. Moving to the next slide. We see here a very different slide to the one on Pakistan. This slide is a slide demonstrating a different idea, a different consensus. It has its own leaders, it has its own symbols, it has its own alliances, and it has its own narrative. And you can see how it's very different, because let's look at the leaders. We have here a picture of Bin Laden and a picture of Zawahiri. The symbols of this movement are very emotive. In fact, they're using religious symbolism. One with the Islamic symbol there of the Kalima, and the other of the Crusaders. And the alliances, we know that Al-Qaeda is a global alliance. It brings together people from very different backgrounds, all fundamentally united behind these leaders and behind the symbolism. And the narrative for this ideology, the narrative was very clear, that there was a war against Islam coming from the West. The Western world was dedicated to fighting Muslims and fighting Islam. And they were after the assets and the wealth of the Islamic nation, and they were there to colonize and set up agents and apostate governments to keep Muslims downtrodden. Now, this is the idea in a slightly different form that I had dedicated myself to propagating for 13 years. I wasn't with Al-Qaeda, I was with a different organization, but nevertheless, the fundamental direction was the same, and the alliances, maybe they differed in methodology, so we weren't involved in suicide bombings and terrorist attacks, but rather we were involved in attempting military coups to take over government, and we nearly succeeded in many countries, including in Pakistan. In fact, some of our members were arrested in 2003 in a purge, in a military purge in Pakistan. They were arrested by Musharraf. So though our methodology wasn't one of terrorism, it was more one of military coups, we fundamentally believed in the same direction as the images you see here, and we were part of that alliance. Now, if we had succeeded in unifying the country behind these leaders and these symbols and behind this alliance, then again the country would have moved forward. Because you don't need the idea to unify a country behind an idea. It doesn't have to be correct. It doesn't have to be true. Simply there needs to be consensus and unity. And I want to give you this example here to demonstrate that point. That here's an example, Nazi Germany, of a nation that did unite behind an idea, but we all know how wrong that idea was. But despite the fact the idea was false, the nation progressed quite rapidly and quite quickly. So I don't need to spend any time at all, in fact, demonstrating why Nazism is a false and totalitarian fascist ideology. But rather, the point I'm simply making here is that Hitler managed to take Germany and launch it forward in a way that it almost dominated Europe entirely. So again, we had the leaders. Here we see Hitler as one of the main leaders of the Nazi movement. We have the symbols with the swastika and the Nazi propaganda poster there that you see. We had the alliance with Italy and the fascists, and how many alliances were made by Hitler. In fact, many collaborators were later discovered to exist throughout Europe who allied with Hitler to spread his ideology. And again, we have the narrative. And remember, the narrative does not have to be necessarily true for it to spread through society. So the narrative of the Nazis was that the Aryan race, essentially white Germans, are superior to all others, and especially to Jews, and the Jews are responsible for all of Germany's troubles. Now that narrative took off. In fact, that narrative still has resonance in many parts of Muslim majority societies, and that narrative is something that was exceptionally powerful, and once again emphasizing that a narrative does not have to be true for people to adhere to it. And I'm showing this slide simply to demonstrate that an idea requires consensus and not necessarily truth for people to follow it and for a nation to progress. Moving finally to the last two slides. This slide here is demonstrating the lack of consensus in Pakistan today in the fundamental direction that the country should take. And so if we look at the leaders, we see contrasted there with Benazir Bhutto and Musharraf, the image for democracy and the image for military rule. If we look at the symbols, we know how confusing Pakistan symbolism is today. And the photograph there of the man praying with guitar is demonstrating that point. With the Shahada, the kalima next to him, and the Facebook slogan, we see how the symbols are confused in Pakistan today. If you look at the alliances, we see how some people wish to take Pakistan in the direction of America and others in the direction of the Taliban. And the narratives are conflicting too. Democracy is the greatest revenge versus death to America. And so today we see a picture of Pakistan that's fundamentally confused as to the direction that the nation wishes to take. There is no consensus on leaders, on ideas, on symbols, on alliances, and nor on narratives. So finally, ending my talk, I would invite everybody to work with us to try and develop a consensus inside Pakistan through civil society activism. What we essentially need is a consensus on who our leaders are and what they represent, which alliances we wish to work with, which symbols we wish to use to represent Pakistan, and what our narrative should be. And then we need to work through society to propagate these four elements of a successfully unified nation. We need to work through society and civil society activism to demonstrate, to propagate the counter-narrative, to what I would believe is a damaging narrative for society, that is the extremist narrative. We need to propagate alternative leaders, alternative symbols, and alternative alliances to build a consensus in Pakistani society so that we're able to move forward. Because though we are able to move forward as a nation, even if we unite behind a false ideology, inevitably that will mean sacrificing our own liberties, sacrificing our own rights, creating a closed-minded society, as Nazi Germany was, which is what Al-Qaeda and their allies would want for Pakistan. And essentially it would mean, I think, eventually defeat on the world stage, or at least lagging behind. And we see the examples of the USSR, we see the examples of Nazi Germany. And we know, even despite the world stage, we know internally inside Pakistan that we would not want the sort of society that stops thought, that oppresses individual choice, and that dictates to us how religion should be interpreted. And so I would suggest that the leaders and the symbols and the alliances should be one of democracy. The narrative should be a pluralistic, democratic narrative. We have Jinnah's speech here in the top of the slide. And so I will end my talk with a hadith of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, where he said in Arabic, إِيَّاكُمْ وَالْغُلُوَّ فِي الدِّينِ, which means, as you see on the screen, beware of extremism in religion. This is a Sahih hadith from Bukhari. And thank you very much. I will move finally now back to the screen so that you're able to see me, and I goodbye to you.